And now it is my really great pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker, my mentor and friend, Rosi Braidotti. She is a distinguished university professor emerita at Utrecht University, a 2022 laureate of the Humboldt Research Award for lifelong contribution to scholarship. Professor Braidotti is author of many influential books that you all know. So I will here list only the most recent one that she co-edited, the Edinburgh Companion to New European Humanities. It is worth reminding the delegates that this is the second time that the Deleuze and Guattari Studies International Conference takes place in the Netherlands. The first was hosted by Rosi herself with Patricia Pisters. I don't know if Patricia is here. Yes, there she is. This was in Amsterdam in 2010, and I recognize some of you who have been there. In the decade to follow, we have collectively built a strong local Deleuze circle with its own yearly conferences. So back to Delft, known for the painter Vermeer and the inventor of microscope, Van Leeuwenhoek, the conceptual persona of the subtle and hard sciences, as Braidotti would put it. Here at TU Delft, at least temporarily, we want to dwell in both cultures simultaneously. And Rosi Braidotti will show us how it's done. Rosi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andre and the Delft team, and thank you, Ian, and the whole EUP organization around the journal. It's very moving to be here again as one of the ancestors of this movement and to see so many young faces. Feels terrific. Hello to the old friends, Patricia and everyone else. Lovely to see you. I put on the timer because I'm going to be very strict, and being a dutiful ancestor means keeping time. Of all the scholarly communities, Deleuze and Guattarian scholars are those who need the least to be reminded of the ethical character of philosophical thinking. Nor do we need to be reminded that the entire affective political economy of Deleuze and Guattari's oeuvre is about how to live the non-fascist life and to deploy its potential affirmatively. Just a quick survey of the publications on fascism and non-fascism produced by you who are present here today will make that point loud and clear. I think we are one of the great anti-fascist communities on the planet. We may put the emphasis on different aspects of the situation, probably disagree on the speed and scale of its historical manifestations. But I think we all agree that Deleuze and Guattari, to read, to live the Deleuze and Guattarian path means to think the non-fascist life, which is the ethically affirmative political praxis life. And yet, given the specific context in which this conference takes place, and mindful of Deleuze's teachings that all philosophical concepts rely on sizable non-philosophical components, that is to say, they are of and in the world, I would like to revisit with you today some of the key passages in the arguments for the politics of joy or affirmation, understood as a way of processing the pain and the turmoil of our times. That is to say, as a way of being worthy of our times, the better to counteract them. You may call this a meditative pause in the midst of the sound and the fury of our times and of this conference, a way of courting the virtual as an affect that circulates among us in a suitably zigzagging mode, of course. So let us gather some of our conceptual tools and start playing with them. Firstly, the non-fascist life is not only the anti-fascist life. We are not dealing here with polarized antitheses or dualistic oppositions, but with affirmative power, potentia. Difference is not being different from, but it is the process of differing. Therefore, we cannot think dialectically either or. We all know that. It's rather a matter of and a little more difficult to apply it, of course. To account for the schizoid workings of contemporary power, we have to abandon the principle of excluded middle. Given that power is a complex strategic situation we constantly inhabit, hello Foucault, with different degrees of reactive and active values, entrapment and empowerment, potestas and potentias, power is best posited as a continuum. And the criteria that allow us to make qualitative distinctions of degrees and speeds of power are ethical, in the sense of an ethology of forces geared on the affirmative. Secondly, affects are not emotions. This implies that terms like active and reactive, negative and positive, which already cannot be understood as dialectical opposite, should not be reduced to emotional states in a psychological frame that assumes the liberal individual as a point of reference. Affects are rather to be understood as transversal forces or flows, to be assessed in terms of their impact on the individuals that we are, and as subject in and of the world. The power to affect and to be affected is what matters, not your own psychological state of mind. Although that comes in the picture as well, of course. The ethical behavior is what can activate and increase relational capacities, potential, and the unethical is what restricts or hampers them. This assumes that the ethical subject desires and is driven to the affirmation of our positive essence, conatus, potentia. We yearn for the expression of freedom and becoming. In other words, human, like all living entities, a strong post-human angle here, are drawn to perpetuate and structurally gravitate around the positivity of going on existing, endurance. What is negative in ethics refers less to a normative moral injunction than to the effect of paralysis and blockage that often come as a result of a hurt, a shock, an injustice, something that blocks you. Can also be intense boredom, luxury issue, but nonetheless negative. Negative passions destroy the soul, their self's capacity to act. They harm their self's ability to interrelate to others, a multitude of others, human and non-humans. They decrease one's relationship to the world. On a larger ecological and social spectrum, negative affects diminish the capacity to express the high levels of interdependence between human, non-human, technological others, organic others. Ecosophy emerges here powerfully. What is positive in the ethics of affirmation is the actual trust and belief that negative relations and passions can be reworked through collective praxis and engagement. This implies a dynamic view of passions and affects, an ongoing process, even of those that freeze us in horror or make us want to vomit. The ethical subject is the one with the force to grasp the freedom to depersonalize the event and transform its negative charge. This has nothing to do, this idea of joy has nothing to do with the cruel optimism of advanced capitalism, nothing to do with the happiness industry, which makes most of us miserable and the likes of Gwyneth Paltrow extremely wealthy. Affirmation is the force that endures and sustains, whereas sad passions are about impotence and disaggregation. Affirmative ethics is the affect that binds together the heterogeneous components of the complex subject assemblages that we are. Thirdly, the ethics of joy does not deny the reality of pain, trauma, and violence, but proposes a different way of dealing with them. Let's put this clearly at the center of the debate once and for all. No more, I don't want to hear that objection anymore. It's Hegel's objection to Spinoza, it's Badiou's and Co.'s objection to Deleuze. It is not the denial of pain, it's a different way of dealing with it. It's a warning against what Deleuze calls the pious harmonization of conflicts, to offer an alternative method to deal with them. The ethics of affirmation does not equate acquiescence with the condition of the presence. Endurance is not the same as resignation. It is actually hard work, the opposite of resignation. What is required is an active process of collective transformation of negative relation and conditions into positive one through political praxis, which begins with an adequate understanding of our conditions. An adequate understanding is where intelligence comes in, but adequate understanding is not the same as passive endorsement. It's in fact the opposite. If affirmation is the hard labor of extracting knowledge from pain without being poisoned and annihilated by it. Endurance is about duration in time, because only positive emotions endure. The negative is a parasite, self-consumes, dissipates. Joyful or affirmative ethics is based on the collective practice of enduring. We can only really do that together. Politically, this means to undo existing conditions so as to actualize alternatives. Fourthly, noology is not ideology. The concept of adequate knowledge or understanding, a Spinoza's concept readapted by Deleuze, requires readjustments of our thought coordinates. It also requires us to move beyond the mantra and the self-satisfied acquired habits of our own tradition, critical theory. We need to move on, and I will return to this in a minute. Understanding is epistemic accountability. In my work, I operationalize it through cartography, by which I mean reasoned accounts of what I understand as the conditions of the present. Philosophy is comparing mapping, so where we are at, of how we go. It's about mapping and designing territories and diagrams by which they can be logistically traversed and formatted. Adequate modes of understanding and representing the present means that epistemology, adequate understanding, intelligence, comes first. And it is epistemology that drives our ethics. The neo-materialist philosophy of immanence demands accountability for one's embodied and embedded locations and an adequate understanding of one's life and conditions. That is to say, adequacy of knowledge means proper accounts of power. We need process of gradual clarification of the ethical forces and political passions at play in one's locations and relationships to one's context, one's life condition. It's a form of cognitive consciousness raising on a collective social scale. It is about knowledge production practices not indexed on humanistic and anthropocentric visions of the subject, but as embedded and embodied in relational fields of forces. Adequate understanding, which is rational, intelligent for both Spinoza and Deleuze, assumes the predominance of inadequate understanding. Here we go, and we have to tread very, very carefully here, because Spinoza is fierce in his attack on what he calls, quite simply, stupidity, inadequate understanding. And for Spinoza, that inadequate understanding, the irrational modes of apprehension of the real, was translated into superstition, bigotry, the fanatical or dogmatic approach to truth. Today we can have our pick. We can go over ideological beliefs, the delusions of unchecked passions, paranoid conspiracy theories, fake news, the appeal to alternative facts. You can go to town on the amount of inadequate forms of knowledge that are being marketed and produced and circulated around us. And now as then, the core issue here is the evil that sprouts from ignorance. And that evil is the opposite of intelligence. And we can choose our terms here. And as I said, Spinoza didn't quite, munch his words. He went for the killing. The task of reaching an adequate understanding of the condition that weigh upon us is hard work in itself. And it is best done in a collaborative and relational manner, in and with a community of scholars. The pursuit of truth as adequate knowledge is driven by shared ethical values that connect us to kindred spirit who share the political concern, affect. This process, therefore, entails the rational and relational pursuit of better knowledge, more adequate knowledge that we, in inverted commas, are capable of producing, achieving, enacting, insofar as we can share in this endeavor. A crucial condition of truth is to come to understand what our embodied and embrained selves can do in a nature-culture continuum, which in Deleuze and Guattari machinery includes technology as second nature. What bodies can do, embodied brains and embrained bodies, in a continuum that defies the dualism of Cartesianism and makes intelligent a quality of all living matter. We think with everything, not only with a black box locked somewhere in the brains. The collective work of constructing affirmation therefore consists of elucidating, thinking properly, understanding the conditions that deter and diminish our clear apprehension of the ethical forces that inhabit us. I refer to this understanding as conatus potentia, our capacity to become other. To live the ethical life, we need to understand in particular the sources of the negativity that prevent us from living the ethical life. It is all about understanding the shortcoming, the pain, the falling short of. So it is epistemology that drives the ethics, that drives the politics. And this is a philosophical argument. Ethics is a matter of forces and relation, a philosophy based on embodied and embedded perspectives, defends a politics based on affirmative ethics that opposes despotism, authoritarianism, but also anarchic populism, which Spinoza describes as mob politics, electing democracy from below as the only system capable of supporting free subject pursuit for adequate knowledge and joyful passions. Spinoza is the thinker of radical democracy. He is the critic of social contract theory. And Deleuze expands this insight into a non-fascist politics of affirmative becoming. Ethics is about differences of speed and scale, modes of relation, difference as becoming. Contemporary fascism stares us in the face, more algorithmic and procedural than in the totalitarian mode that we may remember. And in the second part of my presentation, I want to turn to this phenomenon, 1,000 tiny fascisms that traverse the practice of everyday life in so many different ways. How can the Deleuze and Guattarian ethics of affirmation as political praxis framework help us understand and steer a course through the multiple micro-fascisms that we are confronted by? One, fascism is not only a historical event, but a recurring, self-replicating one. You may remember Umberto Eco's iconic essay, Eternal Fascism. You may remember Primo Levi saying that each generation has to deal with its own forms of fascism. Too easy to confine it to the 1930s. Actually, it's happening in the present and as a mode of relation to the presence. This means that every generation, at some point in chronological time, has to come to the sad conclusion that nowadays, guess what? It has become very cool to be a young fascist. They dress really well. They got good haircuts. They think they make good music. I think it's crap, personally. But the music thing, we leave aside for a moment, because the music is where I think you can tell immediately the inadequate knowledge and the nurtures that you can't kid with that one. Leave it aside. Today more than ever, it is true, as Guattari wrote decades ago, that everybody wants to be a fascist. So why? But why would you want that? Epistemological question needed to be discussed, geared on a community devoted to an ethics of affirmation that wants to understand why everybody wants to be a fascist in order to develop some counter-actualizing strategy to actually say, I would rather not do, if I may, thank you, which is the affirmative way of saying no way. The two ways of saying the same thing. Two, fascism is fully integrated in the liberal state structure, and it's not its antithesis. It pertains to the hierarchical political system, to the patriarchal, homo and transphobic, racist, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic strata and manifestation. It is a viral formation. And again, I will return to this. 3, fascism is operative on a global level. Integrated world capitalism, as Guattari put it back in the 70s. And the vector is the media. Guattari, very smart man, free radio station man, identified in television the new unprecedented power of manipulation of the social imaginary. If he had lived to see what internet has done to the manipulation of information of social imaginary, he would have opened a couple of bottles of Prosecco to say how right I was. There is no contemporary populist, nativist, neo-fascist movement that does not run on platforms, on bots, on algorithm. It really is an algorithmic form of contemporary neo-fascism, protocol-driven, step-by-step, micro-political at its best. You know all about this. 4, contemporary fascism is micro-fascism, that is to say, it's a micro-politics of desire. Everybody wants to be a fascist, wants. There is a permeation of our psychic, affective, and imaginary landscapes that makes certain formation, social, conceptual, epistemological, culinary, aesthetic, attractive. It's really not cool to be a lefty, to be woke. What is it about that? What is this coding that makes fascinating fascism, I'm quoting Susan Sontag, so very strong, so implacably attractive? And as I argued in the introduction to the volume on Deleuze and Guattari and fascism, which I co-edited with Rick Dolphine, whom I salute, it is very easy to be anti-fascist on the molar level and not to see the fascist inside you, the fascist you yourself sustain and nourish and cherish within molecular formations of your personal and collective desires. Individual desires can be and can prove deeply fascist. The key characteristic of the micropolitics of fascist desire is the columns of which the West was one: narcissism and paranoia, an attachment to one's power. An attachment to one's power defined as potestas, that is to say, the lowest possible degree of potentia. When you're in love with that, you're gonna. Power as the desire for strong power, for definite and final solutions, for stone-hard identities, for clear borders and markers of exclusion, for single issues, causes, and arguments. The micro-fascism of either or, with me or against me, of expulsion, exclusions on a global scale, egotistical, delirious, megalomaniac, profoundly unintelligent. 5, fascism is post-ideological, proliferates of many different forms, rural and urban, youth and old age, war veteran, Texan, Rwandan, Italian, South Dutch. It's not a totalitarian organism, but spreads more like a disease, always a cancerous multiplicity of contaminating bodies. Remember, Deleuze uses the image of cancer, Spinoza uses the image of poison. In both cases here, we have an immunological argument, which I don't have the time to go into in this paper, but we do go in the book with Dolphine. We talk about the specific immunological paradigm that comes with the ethics of affirmation. Is very, very different from the biopolitical in Agamben and Co. 6, fascist nihilism lingers on and it rocks on. The politics of resentment and negativity, one of the staples of classical fascist discourse, repeating itself with incredible predictability and astounding force. The components of the politics of resentment are always the same: sexism, misogyny, homo and transphobia, racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, white supremacy, contempt for science, contempt for human intelligence in general, the worship of death, the necessity of war. It's really it's like a refrain returning, and all of a sudden we're all off quoting Woody Allen, marching off to invade Poland yet again. This kind of glorification of the heroic moment, as if the only mode of engagement with the complexity of the present were warrior-like. A very manifest death drive expresses itself in an apocalyptic imaginary of the collapse of civilization, the end of the West, and the hordes coming to invade us. It is the sickness of a hatred that also expresses a profound self-hatred. It is the tragedy of masses of disaffected individuals turning to disillusioned and promises of redemption, and political classes and media platforms all too quick to manipulate them, turning negativity into the fuel for a toxic social-political environment. This is the core of micro-fascism, the cult of negativity, of narcissistic, egotistical personalities, hatred, and more hatred. The sense that there is no future. Deleuze called micro-fascism the sadness of the soul. Why even get out of bed? And the moment they get you in the soul, your potentia is sapping out of you, and you are a sick, contaminated body. Micro-fascism proliferates on the left as well as the right of the political spectrum. The right recycles the same old refrains I just mentioned, and the left instrumentalizes, exploits working class exhaustion and exploitation by decades of economic injustice and neoliberal austerity, coupling them with fear of xenophobic invasion, turning very justified rage into xenophobic, and in some cultures, homo-transphobic hatred of otherness. A combination of cocktails that requires quite a cartography. In the book with Delphine, we gave several examples from different countries of how contemporary microfascism is forming itself. In some cultures in Europe, the Netherlands, for instance, the neo-fascists are not homophobic, and they are not anti-feminist, so long as the feminists and the gays involved are white, and racism overrides everything else. In the south of Europe, it's across the board. So I think a careful mapping of the components of the cocktail would be needed here to invent together a concerted response to this cocktail. From a philosophical perspective, populism, with its ancestral prejudices and contemporary fake news and alternative truth, is an inadequate form of knowledge of both ourselves and others. It's a form of dishonesty and ignorance, negationist in relation to climate change, paranoid towards ethnic diversity, hyper-nationalist, anti-globalist, nostalgic, reactionary. It is a massive monument to unintelligence, and Spinoza would not, again, munch his word, a case of global stupidity. 7, the populists express their negativity through the paranoid rhetoric of the lament. I would like to make a rock opera in which we affirmative people take the lament, the complaint, and the whinging, and we really rip it apart. And the end of this, and the end. I made a list in the book of all the books that have come with either end or extinction or death. It is an orgy of the end of this and the end of that. Caught between the fourth industrial revolution and the sixth extinction, populist rhetoric of the lament spread through internet becomes a discourse of civilizational decline, fear of ethnic replacement, racism. It is a delirium of negativity that makes Edward Spengler's The Decline of the West, a classic of 1930s fascism, read like a fairy tale. It is so widespread that it has now become a recognized field of study. It's called collapsology, and you can do an MA in this at the University of Heidelberg if you wish. It is the collapse of this, the collapse of that, the collapse of that, the end of that. And what this really does express is an intense attack of fear and panic almost, but what used to be one of the centers, one of the possible centers of the world, Eurocentric, masculine, heteronormative, comfortable, all of a sudden confronted by difficulties and violations and injustices, reacts with a moment of intense fear and panic, as if white pain was the only pain in the world. And I will return to this in a minute when we talk about climate change. this sense of the earth is over, the devastation is finished, there is no future. Elon Musk, who now has not only declared planet Earth dead, but it has launched the next space exploration. 80% of NASA business is private. And the opening of extraction economies on other planets, Mars essentially, is very, very advanced, with the moon station opening up in 25 or 26, with the first humans going up to open the petrol station, my language, for the robots that we will shoot up to Mars to be able to mine cobalt. Cobalt produces lithium that we need for the batteries for the electric cars. They will stop at nothing, precisely, as Deleuze and Guattari intend. It's capitalism as schizophrenia to a delirious extent. But it's positive on a vote of negativity. The earth is finished. There's nothing more to mine. Climate change is coming. The white population is a minority. Let's get out of here. And the new space race needs to be looked at very, very carefully as an example of how delirious the system can get. Taking on the roots of this profound epistemic and historical violence is what we need to do. But who is we? And that's point 8. Who are we who compose this resisting humanity? Whose pain and anxiety is being expressed by this we? Affirmative new materialist ethics has a strong decolonial element that looks at this orgy of negativity, the rhetoric of the lament, in the context of global geopolitical relations. On climate change, I work at RMIT in Melbourne with Aboriginal elders who are actually relying on indigenous philosophies to prove that, quite simply, the end of the world for indigenous people came a long time ago. In some cases, in 1492, as the white colonialist power landed in various parts of the globe, bringing with us not only cultural genocide, but also ecocide, the devastation of nature. And yet, as many of our indigenous writers, Valerio de Castro would be the one who is the closest to the Deleuzean community, Philippe Descola also, that they survive, they endure, they're masters of endurance. So a decolonial approach to the rhetoric of the lament can actually open up our eyes to how limited the viewpoint is, how terribly selfish, and how contingent in some way, and how we need to open the academic, the philosophical discussion to other perspectives. I have also argued, particularly in the Posthuman trilogy, that a materialist approach with Deleuze and Guattari is a good starting point for an alliance with cosmology and philosophical systems that do not have the nature-culture division or the mind-body divisions, that are open to the notion of a continuum. Radical immanence and new materialism are great bases to start from to critique the totally selfish and delirious orgy of lament by white cultures in front of the challenges of technology, the challenges of the environmental devastation, and the great socioeconomic fractures that mark our era. Instead of giving into the politics of resentment and rage, let us try to understand, let us look for alliances, let us get working, detoxifying the practice of critical theory from this attachment to the negative, to the lament. Why is it that to be intelligent means that you whinge and complain all the time? And if actually you look remotely, try this. Try smiling to people, even at this conference. People look at you and say, "What are you smiling at? Are you stupid or something?" And I'm just smiling, just saying. What is it? That it's very genderized, it's very racialized. Intelligent people are gloomy, really completely unpleasant, pessimistic, and they only whinge. Then you're really, really intelligent. What about intelligence as creativity? What about intelligence as the generosity of constructing communities that actually forge alternatives, that kind of reach out to other communities and learn something instead of pontificating about the course that you think human history is taking? Get a life, as we say in Melbourne. So radical immanency, a great guide, new materialism, I skipped the part because you all know it, but think about the generative force of living matter and the type of non-fascist vitalism, the non-deterministic philosophy of life that we get in Deleuze through Spinoza. Yes, life lives and life is intelligent, but it is not life with a capital L as a transcendent unit. It is the humble immanence of just a life. So my throwaway line, get a life, rests on profound materialistic credential. We're looking here at a general ecology of complex relations, zoe, geo, techno, mediated relations, multiple ecologies that make meta a living, intelligent, self-organizing, common platform out of which we can function. So affirmative ethics leaning on this is the remedy against the micro-fascist cult of negativity and the social poison that it spreads, coupled with the lesson of Guattari on the importance of looking at media within integrated world capitalism. The media is a massive contemporary micro-fascist machinery. The antidote, the immunity shot against the social pathologies of polarized, hateful rejection of the interdependence of our culture on so many other cultures and on so many non-human agents as well. Reaching an adequate understanding of the condition that led us to this predicament, undoing collapsology as an inadequate rendition of what is happening to us, is the necessary starting point. Intelligent, but we can only become intelligent together by comparing notes towards a cartography of adequate understanding of what is happening, achieving an accurate description and assessment of what is happening around us, in this particular case, multiple formation of micro-fascism, but also multiple possibility of resistance. The function of epistemological clarity is to lead to ethical action, to empower us to act, starting from the composition of a plane of immanence or encounter. So we need a reappraisal of community building as the basis for collective action, aimed at affirming forms of social and political interaction in the respect of the diversity that we all represent here. Relational webs need not function in a linear manner. Per definition, webs are not linear. We need to get to accuracy within the diversity, proper understanding within variation of affects, of speed and degrees of ethical engagement with the world. It's hard work. We can call it philosophy if we wish. It's manual work, and it takes part as much in the world as it does in academia. Knowing that affirmation is the empowering ethical force that increases our ability to relate and to take in and to take on more of the world. And that negativity is the opposite, a decrease of our relational capacity and empathy to others. Choosing joy or affirmation means choosing action rather than reaction. Affirmation rather than negativity and resentment. Action rather than stagnation and paralysis. It means looking at the sadness in your soul and saying, I would rather you go away. Thank you. So how to lead the non-fascist life, and I'm going to the conclusion, confronted by refrains of negativity of political leaders who wish us ill and make us sick while pretending to care, socially enforced modes of unintelligence, faced by dishonesty, violence, we will echo Deleuze and Guattari and say, we, grounded, embedded, and embodied entities in this heterogeneous assemblage that is this conference, would prefer not to follow the path of negativity. Affirmative ethics is an active, tonic, dynamic response to the micro-fascist genre of nothing can be done, the sky is falling, it's all over. The crucial question, remember, is who we are. We are not one and the same. Diversity, decolonial perspective, feminist gender insights are terribly important here, but we do need to compose together a plane of agreement, a plan of encounter to compare notes on our shared hopes and the kind of tools that we need to construct together social horizons of hope. We need fierce discussions, negotiations, and an occasional laugh or two wouldn't harm, to try to craft together the instrument, the tool, to insert the antidote, the immunity shot against the pathology, the social pathologies of our time. We progressive thinkers of all kinds need to stop weaponizing our differences. We have to stop turning everything into a culture war and make the model of war and antagonism the only model we can deal with. It doesn't mean that we need to become willy-nilly softy liberal agreeing on everything. We can fiercely disagree and agree to differ so long as we compose micro-assemblages of individuals who aspire to the same degrees and force and speed of intervention into the world. The only world we have, the one that we compose and that compose us. It is not a simple or pain-free process, but anger alone is not a project. Rage alone is not a project. Despair turning into cynicism is not a project. In a humble, constitutive mode of togetherness within the difference, I think we can activate ourselves. It's in the doing. The affirmative ethics is in the praxis of reaching out, composing the alliances, the transversal connections, entering difficult conversations with an aim, being the good of the world, the collective struggle against the poisoning of the social sphere, the rise of unintelligence in the mode of toxic negativity. Critique and creation need to work hand in hand, as do the critical and clinical aspects of our ethical praxis. We need to re-radicalize ourselves, but differentially, rhizomatically, across 1,000 plateaus of affirmative becomings, in spite of the time and out of love for the times. Thank you.
We skip Q&A.
Whatever you want. How are we doing for time?
7, 8 minutes.
But maybe take several questions at once.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much.
Oh, hi.
So when I read like 1930s, 1920s fascists and even contemporary people, again and again they tend to articulate their projects in immunological terms, in terms of poison. And it makes me really concerned about the way Deleuze talks about sadness in those terms. And I worry that using those kinds of images can lead us to have a kind of accidentally fascist perspective on them. And I was just wondering what your sort of response to that, the problem of that image is.
I think it would be fantastic. Do I go immediately, Chair? Where's my chair? I take question per question, right? Yeah. Stop me if you see that I go off into another lecture. I think one could start this talk again and do it all through the immunological paradigm. The problem with the standard immunological paradigm, I'm thinking Esposito, I'm thinking Derrida's pharmacon, is that it is actually imbued with social constructivism, has no materialist grounding, and is very dichotomous, it's very dualistic. And also in the case of the Italian thinkers, Agamben included, poor Agamben is Novax, so we can't name him anymore. They haven't taken in the lessons of feminism, the less of the decolonial thinking, so they're peculiarly Eurocentric. But even leaving that aside, the idea, I think we need to look carefully at the poison image in Spinoza and in the more viral aspect of Deleuze, and on the notion of the clinical. See, the idea that critical theory is actually a clinical exercise as well as a critical one is terribly important. And I think we would need a discussion on what model of immunology we would use for this. I'll give you two quick answers. In my conversation with Rick, who I think is not here, but I keep naming him, we supplemented Deleuze with a man that he loved dearly. He had two great friends in life. One is Guattari, the friend of the youth, but there is the friend of his old age. I'm very jealous of people who can, having reached a certain age, of people who can make good friends and over 60. And that is Michel Serres. And Michel Serres, the parasite, I think, is a supplement to some of the things that Deleuze says. And they talk, there's quite a few conversations between them on how you need to become a good host. It's a bit the pharmacon of this. You need to train yourself not to treat the epidemic or the poison as an external object to be exterminated. Micro-fascism is within each one of us. We're all in love with some sort of power. We can't be citizens of advanced capitalism and not be. So it's a constant effort to detox, to get a life, to get grounded, to get real. So that's one model, and I think that balancing act is where affirmative ethics can help. There's no point saying I'm against capitalism and then reach out for your mobile phone. If you have a mobile phone, you can't be against capitalism, so get a life. Because if you then are part of the problem, you have to become part of the solution of the problem. Detox. So it is constant. The other model I've worked with, particularly in the post-human feminism book, is what I call the politics of placenta. That is a very advanced materialist feminist theory, where we look at how bodies themselves, in this case, the pregnant body, whoever may be, whichever gender may be carrying that body, is actually engendering modes of cohabitation with a parasite. Because in pregnancy, the parasite doesn't get expelled, doesn't get killed, it gets nurtured. So there is a different paradigm here, and I've seen a lot of work on placenta politics and feminist immunology coming up. But it would be very useful to make this a research issue and create different assemblages of people looking at the immunology part in a creative manner. The Novak's issue now in the far right is a bit like the denial of climate change. We have the denial of science, the denial of immunology, the denial of climate change. So there is a peculiar neo-medieval construction of knowledge, or construction of stupidity around us, which as people of science, we really need to address. In my country, Italy now, people don't even want to do very basic vaccination of their children, smallpox. So what is happening here with the obscurantism of the day? So there are multiple areas of this, and so I can only give you a tentative answer. I was actually quite disciplined then. Very much so, thank you. But nevertheless, I think that's it for now. We break and we continue at 12 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Two things.
Thank you.